For 5 years, they were sworn enemies, locked in a bitter war over a measly 6 inches of dirt. Their hatred for each other was a local landmark, a source of endless neighborhood gossip, and a masterclass in human stubbornness. But then, slowly, came an afternoon when the sky turned a sick shade of green and the world itself threatened to rip apart. Suddenly, their years of fighting were the last thing that mattered. To understand how these two rivals ended up fighting for each other's lives, a fight that would change everything, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to the tiny spark that lit up a suburban battleground. It didn't start with a grand betrayal or a crime of passion. Nope, this war started, like so many do, with something almost laughably small, a property line. But this story isn't just about how petty people can get. It's about what happens when two people who've built their lives around hating each other are suddenly forced to choose between that hate and their own survival. It's a story that proves sometimes the only way to find common ground is to burn everything else down first. On one side of the fence, you had Frank. Frank was a retired engineer, a man who lived his life by the rules of order, precision, and right angles. His lawn was proof. A perfect emerald green carpet edged with military sharpness. His petunias were arranged in color-coded formations. For Frank, there was a right way to do things, and every other way was just wrong. He was a measure twice, cut once kind of guy. On the other side lived Brenda. Brenda was a sculptor and a true free spirit, a woman who saw the world not as a grid, but as a gloriously chaotic canvas. Her garden was a wild explosion of life. Sunflowers and hollyhocks grew in tangled messes, and wind chimes made of old silverware sang their own weird tune in the breeze. She believed you couldn't tame nature, you just had to encourage it. For years, they lived in a state of silent, mutual disapproval. Frank would scowl at the dandelion seeds drifting onto his perfect turf. Brenda would roll her eyes at the sterile, lifeless perfection of his yard. They were separated by a simple chain-link fence and a massive canyon of personal philosophy. And then came the survey. Frank, getting ready to install a new sprinkler system, had his property lines reassessed. The results were, to him, a catastrophe. It turned out the old fence was off by 6 inches. 6 inches! That meant Brenda's most cherished rosebush, a sprawling, fragrant beast she'd nurtured for 15 years, was technically on his property. Armed with a clipboard and the fury of a man whose orderly world had been violated, Frank presented his findings. He didn't ask, he informed her. The bush had to go. Brenda, who loved that rosebush like a family member, just laughed in his face. It was a laugh that rang out across the quiet lawns of suburbia, the first shot in a war neither of them saw coming. She told him exactly where he could stick his survey. The line had been drawn. The first shot was subtle. Frank, being an engineer, accidentally set his new sprinklers to arc just over the fence, drenching Brenda's sun-loving succulents every morning. Within a week, they were a rotten, mushy mess. Brenda's revenge was just as passive-aggressive. She suddenly took up composting, building a huge, stinking pile of kitchen scraps and grass clippings right up against the fence, perfectly placed to ruin Frank's quiet evenings on his patio. This kicked off what the neighbors called the debris wars. Frank weaponized his leaf blower, meticulously blasting every last leaf and twig from his yard directly onto hers. Brenda, ever the artist, fought back with her own medium. She started a found object sculpture project, which mostly involved chucking rotten garbage back over the fence. A moldy grapefruit here, a week-old fish head there. The police were called for the first time when Frank accused Brenda of catapulting rancid shrimp into his koi pond. She denied it, but the officer noted her smug smile. When garbage wasn't enough, they moved on to psychological warfare. The sign wars began. Brenda started it by placing a garden gnome with its little finger pointing accusingly at Frank's house. Frank, a man of technology, fired back with a large, programmable LED sign. His first message, in bright red letters, was, "My neighbor's yard is a registered Superfund site." This escalation was wild. Brenda retaliated with a huge painted banner that just said, "Worst neighbor ever," with a giant arrow pointing at Frank's door. Frank programmed his sign with a new insult every hour. "Beware of falling standards. I've seen better landscaping in a prison yard." And his masterpiece, "My petunias have more personality." The whole thing became a public spectacle. Neighbors would slow their cars to see the latest installment. Police visits were a regular thing, eventually topping 70 calls for everything from noise complaints to aggressive composting. Frank reported Brenda for a dozen code violations. She dug up an obscure bylaw about light pollution and filed a formal complaint against his LED sign. She even threatened to start keeping bees, knowing Frank was terrified of them. It all peaked in the 4th year. Frank, driven to the absolute edge, decided to build a wall. And this wasn't just some friendly wooden fence. This was a monument to pure hatred. He collected old tires, corrugated metal, and discarded pallets and built an 8-foot-tall monstrosity that completely blocked the view between their homes. It was his masterpiece of spite. The silence that fell between them after that was heavier and more menacing than any of the shouting that had come before. They had successfully erased each other, creating 2 little islands of bitterness, completely unaware that a force was coming that would obliterate all of it. The day it all changed started like any other in their Cold War. Then, in the afternoon, the sky began to shift. The air grew heavy and still. An eerie greenish-yellow tint bled across the horizon. Then came the sirens, not the familiar police sirens, but the deep, moaning wail of a tornado warning. This wasn't a drill. The storm hit like a freight train. The wind screamed, ripping at roofs and tossing patio furniture around like confetti. For Frank, the most terrifying sound was the shriek of twisting metal. He watched in horror as his magnificent wall of spite was torn apart and flung into the air. Then came the crash, a sickening, splintering groan, followed by a ground-shaking impact. A huge chunk of his wall, mixed with a massive tree limb, had been slammed directly into Brenda's house, caving in the roof of her art studio. Just as quickly as it started, the tornado was gone. An unnatural silence fell. Frank's house was damaged, but he was safe. His first feeling? Grim satisfaction. His second? A jolt of pure adrenaline. He could hear a faint cry from the wreckage next door. He ran outside. The devastation was absolute. His perfect lawn was gone. The giant oak tree in his backyard had been ripped from the ground, its trunk now blocking the only road out. No one was getting in. He was on his own, and Brenda was crying for help. He stood there for a second, frozen. This woman was his enemy. He'd spent years wishing bad things on her, but hearing that weak, terrified voice from under the splintered beams of his own creation, it was a sound that cut right through years of hate. It was the sound of a person in pain. He grabbed a crowbar and a car jack from his garage and picked his way through the debris, shouting her name. He found her pinned under a roof beam, her arm bent at a sickening angle. Using the jack and crowbar, he grunted with effort and slowly, inch by inch, lifted the beam just enough for her to crawl out. She was covered in dust, cradling her broken arm, but she was alive. Then they heard a sharp hiss, and the unmistakable, sickening smell of natural gas filled the air. A line had ruptured. Their street was now a time bomb. Frank started to panic, but Brenda, despite the pain, was strangely calm. "There's a way out," she said, her voice strained. "Through the woods. It comes out near the miller's place." She knew the woods behind their houses like the back of her hand. It was her escape. Frank, who never set foot off his own property, would be lost in minutes. And so the unlikely team was born. Frank, the man of order, became her crutch, supporting her weight. Brenda, the free spirit, became his guide, pointing the way through the storm-ravaged forest. They moved slowly, him clearing the path, her giving directions. They didn't talk about the feud. They didn't talk about the wall. They only talked about survival. "Watch your step there. Left of that fallen tree. You okay?" Simple words stripped of all history that meant more than all the thousands of angry words they had thrown at each other. They stumbled out of those woods half an hour later, muddy, exhausted, and in pain, but together. They had saved each other.
What's the most surprising way you've ever had to connect with someone you thought you couldn't stand? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, hit that subscribe button because you never know when the next great story is waiting to be told. Sitting in the Miller's living room, wrapped in blankets, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't a weapon. It was different. Frank looked at Brenda's pale, pain-etched face and didn't see the woman who ruined his property value. She saw the woman who had guided them to safety. Brenda looked at Frank's exhausted, grimy face and didn't see the tyrant who hated her garden. She saw the man who had pulled a roof off her art studio. There were no big apologies, just a shared nod, a quick glance that said everything about how absurd their war had been. In the weeks that followed, the cleanup began. The first sign things had truly changed was when Frank showed up at Brenda's door, not with a clipboard, but with a toolkit. He spent the next 3 weekends helping her rebuild the frame